Good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olke, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, our Executive Director, Chris Costa, is joined by Uzi Arad, former head of Israel's National Security Council. Uzi is a well-known strategist and thought leader who is currently a senior fellow at the Yuval Ne'eman Workshop for Science, Technology, and Security at Tel Aviv University. He served as National Security Advisor to Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu and head of the Israeli National Security Council between 2009 and 2011. Uzi was Netanyahu's foreign policy advisor from 1997 to 99, and between 1975 and 1999, he served with Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence service. Uzi held senior positions domestically and abroad and was advisor to the Knesset, Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, and ultimately became director of the Intelligence Division. Chris is going to pose some questions to Uzi, and then, after their discussion, we'll turn to your questions. Please use the Q&A feature to write them in. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Also, a quick note before I kick this over to Chris. For those of you who have been to our virtual programs before, you may notice we've had a bit of an upgrade. We are thrilled to be broadcasting from the Spy Museum's new studio space at Podville Media, which means we have this gorgeous background and another one coming, and some truly sleek new camera work. Thank you to the staff at Podville for their assistance and expertise in preparing us for this new adventure. But don't worry, Hannah and Shauna are still behind the scenes keeping us on track. Now, over to you, Chris.
Amanda, thanks a lot for the great introduction. I, too, am very excited about this program, particularly because of our guest as well as the new setting. So I'm really excited to have this talk with Uzi. I think it's a timely discussion on events in Israel, the Israeli-Hamas war that is currently ongoing. It is a sobering subject, to be sure. But before we dive in, I just want a little commercial break to offer that we're going to share the recent Spycast that was released by the International Spy Museum with Uzi Arad and our historian, Dr. Andrew Hammond. It's absolutely an outstanding listen. I paid very close attention, listened to it twice, and I felt like I knew Uzi. We've only met just today, but I feel like I have a sense for his career and his background having listened to that podcast. And also, we're going to share an article I wrote which gets to the heart of one of the questions that I'm going to ask Uzi in a moment. So then, rather than me offering a whole lot of perspectives from the United States perspective as a former intelligence officer, as somebody that served at our National Security Council, I really want to turn to Uzi and dive in with three questions. First question is, how did October 7th happen? The strategic surprise dimension. The second question, is there a broadening war? Is there a widening war that's going to take place? We see Lebanon. We're concerned about Syria, Iraq. Are there other implications? The Houthis. So that access that's currently aggressive in the region, is that going to trigger a broader war than we're already seeing play out today? And the last question is, none of us can know for sure, but how is this going to end? What do you think, Uzi? So those are the questions. If you can kick it off, Uzi, and thank you. It is a privilege to have you here today. I am grateful that you took the opportunity to help educate our audience.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here and to share some thoughts about the questions that you put forth, because they are very central questions, and I will try to answer them as best as I can. Knowing that we are in the midst of a crisis, but also I would like to put the emphasis on what is the natural interest of your institution, which is on the intelligence function and experiences. The first question that you posed about strategic surprise is perhaps by far the most dramatic and the most important of questions, because once again, so it seems, Israel is subject to be militarily attacked. Now, there is nothing which is more devastating in the course of history of a nation than to be attacked in the first place and by surprise in the second place. And when the two are combined, the effect is devastating, as I said. The sentiment that is felt and was felt by everybody was of being simply overwhelmed by the surprise, took the form of not knowing where you are at. It's not the average guy on the street that did not know, but even the leaders of Israel did not know when things were unfolding what was going on. They were surprised to the highest degree that you can. You see, in 73, in real terms, we had hours notice that an attack was imminent. And those few hours do matter because the leaders can concentrate their minds, can reflect about possible means, perhaps to preempt, perhaps to take measures. So those precious hours were very, very important at the time, even though in totality it was a major surprise when we were caught unprepared for a joint Syrian-American attack. This time around, there was not even 1 second of respite. The first moment that the prime minister had any inkling that an attack is on the way was when it happened. So the surprise effect, the sense of loss of any sense, any direction, took hours while the attack was unfolding. And it is at that time that all those barbaric things were committed. And the more news came from the scene of those atrocities and the attack and the invasion, it was more and more puzzling. The word used by most people was that it is simply incredible. Everybody said, we cannot even understand what is going on. That much is the effect of surprise. Now, the big question is the following. How did it happen? Clearly, that was something that we were supposed to prevent and to work on preventing. It is vital in Israel that that warning be given because our army is not mobilized and we are not ready with any defenses on the ground. We were caught by surprise, and once that happened, we were at the loss of any means of blunting the attack. So the need for a warning is all the much higher than for any other nations. And the absence was all the more devastating, as I said. Now, what are the causes of this surprise? There is a commission of inquiry that will go into the details, the technical details, because, people are likely to generalize about military surprises and compare that to the long, long list of famous surprises. But that can be misleading. As they say, all happy marriages are the same or whatever it's the same. All surprises are different from one another. And when you analyze into the causes, was it a failure of the imagination? Was it a failure of the collection agencies? What was a failure of that critical interface between the intelligence and the policymakers? Which in our case, the answer is yes, it was a failure of all those combined. It was almost like a perfect storm of everything that can go wrong did go wrong. We had insufficient warning. We had insufficient advance information about what was coming. We had flaws in the communication of whatever that was obtained. The indicators that showed up were ignored by the headquarters. And the worst scene of all, the prime minister was completely without any communication in real terms with the intelligence system, which was edging to try to sort out what was going. These were technical, institutional, professional flaws, which would be examined and understood better than we know now when the Commission of Inquiry that will look into it, very much like the Commission of Inquiry, and there was more than one after September 11. It took time for the US to understand what took it by surprise then. It will take a similar amount of time for us to understand how we were subject to the same kind of surprise by a small Islamic terrorist organization, certainly not on par with our might, just as Al-Qaeda is not a match to the great America, yet it caught America by surprise. And we were caught by a similar surprise, although of different character.
So thank you, Uzi, for that. That's a great explanation. And I would just offer just a comment that, having studied Pearl Harbor, Roberta Wohlstetter wrote a very comprehensive assessment of the strategic surprise there. You alluded to the 9/11 Commission report. Some of the similar dynamics are always present, and yet it happens repeatedly throughout history. And I think you got to the central point. Intelligence services are responsible ultimately for strategic warning. And in many cases, that strategic warning breaks down. So let's pivot to the next question of a wider, broader war as you see it. And I can offer my perspectives briefly when you're done, but what are we seeing? Is there a broader war breaking out? Is it going to get worse in the Middle East? We certainly can't know for certain, but what is your assessment of that question of a broader war, a broadening war, if you will?
As you allude, yes, it is a broader war, and it has been a broader conflict for while it were lasting. Let's just count the numbers of the parties, the actors who are involved in this militarily. I'm not saying diplomatically or politically, just militarily. Well, of course, you have the Hamas, which is the Palestinian Islamic radical jihadist group. But closely associated to that, and you see that also escalating, was the Hezbollah, which is a different kind. It is to our north, and it is active because already now there is a lower intensity friction in the north, but it is taking place, and it is there that the likelihood of escalation is the most menacing. But then behind those two groups, you have Iran, which is very much the engine of some of these activities by being a supplier, a trainer, a coordinator, a facilitator of some of those acts when it uses those groups as proxies of itself. And so it does with other proxies it has in Iraq, in Yemen, and it might have Syria and so forth. So you have Iran. But it is not only that. Iran, for example, had already attacked Saudis, and the Saudis are directly involved militarily. They've been fired at very severely, by the way, when the oil facilities were attacked, which is an interesting point. When oil facilities in the Middle East attack, that becomes a regional issue because energy supply is a regional issue. And remember that Iran is also vulnerable to be attacked when it comes to its oil facilities. And an event took place the other day. But then you have others involved. You have Egypt and Jordan being involved in the negotiations with the security forces. And the more you look at it, practically everybody in the Middle East, and last but not least, Qatar, which has been playing its own regional role, being a supplier of means and money to the Hamas. But then when you look at it even further, it is not only a regional. You have the out-of-region powers which are active. The US is already involved, being fired at and reacting to. It is very involved in the diplomacy that is now taking place around the Gaza issue. It is supplying arms. Russia is there because of its vicinity. It is placed in Syria. It is indirectly involved. You have the European allies, NATO allies, already sending forces to be here to deter. So I wouldn't say it is a global war, but it is a regional war in which the involvement of many is already there. And it could escalate even further. You did say that. Well, let's not assume that it is inevitable that it will escalate. It may even go, if diplomacy succeeds, to de-escalate. And maybe that is what is hoped for. But at the moment, the risks of escalation are very high because all the parties are acting and sometimes escalating on their own terms in one active or another, running the risk that one thing will lead to another thing. None, I think, wanted to escalate to the full extent of the escalation ladder because that's too unthinkable to think. but it is a very dangerous exercise, and the dynamics are very dangerous, and the odds that it will escalate in several directions is really serious. So I think this has been the case, and this will remain the case. The overall reason why this tends to be an escalation of a regional war is because the matter that we have here, in very general terms, is a confrontation between a group of nations and sub-nations entities which have a fundamentalist Islamic tendency, which are practicing terrorism as an instrument which fits their condition, which in so doing, they're committing grave crimes in many, many ways. And they're doing that, many, with hostility towards the West, towards the United States, towards Israel. And this has been a battle that has been going on. When I alluded to September 11, that was another battle in the same war. And on the other side, there is a group of nations who are trying to combat this tendency, this hostile, aggressive movement. And all the indicators are that this will not subside, even if this circle around of war in Gaza subsides. The war, the attack that is mounted against us, the West powers and so forth, in the Middle East by Islamic fundamentalists using terrorism and other types of force is about to continue, and the battle may wage on.
Uzi, so thank you for that, again, explication, right, on the situation ongoing and the risks of a broader war, the risk of escalation. And I also appreciate you talking about the terrorism dynamic. With that, we have a hostage situation, along with the question of how does this end. I have to ask you a question we didn't talk about previously, but it's the question of hostage taking and the compatibility of an objective of Israel to destroy Hamas and at the same time to bring hostages home, to rescue hostages. Is that compatible? Are those two objectives reasonably done together, bringing hostages home and defeating a terrorist organization, Hamas?
Well, strategically, you're right in posing the question, and the easy answer is that it is in part compatible and in other part incompatible. But let me focus on the very notion of hostage taking. I was trying to think about similarities of other nations having found themselves, their own citizens, being held hostage. And although there are many dissimilarities in this, I remember the Tehran capture of the American hostages in the compound of the American embassy, and hundreds of them being kept for more than a year, I think, as hostages of those radical Islamic students, so to speak, in Iran. So the U.S. was in a condition in which it had diplomats and civilians being held for more than a year as hostages. I don't think that there was any serious threat to their lives, but still it was a very unpleasant condition. The U.S. tried a rescue mission. It was a valiant rescue mission. It had many difficulties to it and did not succeed. They were finally released after a process. But what was the feeling felt by an enormous country, powerful country as the U.S., having found its own diplomats being kept illegally, of course, by those groups, those violence groups? That's an experience that resembles in sorts, and it is interesting to see how the United States dealt with it. Now, the second thing we have to note, that taking hostages has become a kind of a recipe for those terrorist organizations. It has become one of their tools that they practice most effectively. It looks like pirates in the past or in our history where people were captured so as to bargain about them and to negotiate over them. And we have examples throughout history. In modern history, this is practiced primarily by terrorist groups. And they, in so doing, they leverage their position, they obtain publicity, and they're doing that, of course, without any degree of mercy or compassion to their captives, often being mistreated and sometimes killed. So the Hamas, in this case, they invaded Israeli territory to capture those hostages. That was their war objective. They prepared those cages in the tunnels of Gaza to keep them, to negotiate with them and over them. They know our Western, our Jewish, Christian sensitivity to human lives and our commitment to rescuing them. And they're using that because it is an instrument of force typical primarily of terrorists. And it has become a tactical issue for us. Now, how we will manage that, I don't know. Because the dynamics of this bargaining over the release of hostages has become an art into itself in South America, in Latin America, in Asia, in the Middle East. Very complicated. The policymakers involved follow different routes. To say that you will never negotiate with terrorists is sometimes silly to say, but to say that you will always negotiate so as to rescue is always silly. What do you do? What do you do? How do you trade off the possibility of release or to take the possibility of rescuing themselves in the process or risking themselves? This is an enormously difficult issue. And I think that the Israeli government will have to balance this against the purpose for which the Hamas is using those terrorists, those hostages, to influence and to defend themselves from the Israeli attack by putting them as human shields, threatening their lives, and in so doing, stopping the possibility that the Israeli forces would come to attack them successfully. So it's a dicey issue, and I don't think there is a sure recipe how to do that. Depends on circumstances.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's very important to note that hostage taking, as you mentioned, is never acceptable. It's a terrorist tactic. And also, we could spend all day talking about trends in hostage taking. Today, wrongful detainees, however you characterize it, it is wrong, unacceptable. Principally, we're talking about civilians losing their right to be free, and it's completely unacceptable. You talk about Iran, that was a state in 1979 that took over an embassy, violating all norms. And then, of course, 1972 was my beginning of understanding hostage taking with what occurred in 1972 Munich. Really began my journey and had quite an imprint on my development, my later career. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand hostage taking, participating in exercises, and ultimately working on hostage matters at the White House from a policy standpoint. So I've watched this very closely. I appreciate some of your insights on that. Never acceptable, and it continues to be a strategy employed by non-state actors as well as state actors. So we're doing okay on time. Uzi, before we go to questions, the big question that I have is, how does this end? I get asked that question. I certainly cannot know. There are people that are pushing for a two-state solution. That is a broad question. How does this end? What happens in Gaza? What happens in the wake of defeating Hamas, if it can in fact be defeated? What comes in place in Gaza? These are the questions, frankly, that I wrestled with Syria, with the successful defeat ISIS plan at the Trump White House when we were sorting out what comes after military success. So with that, could you handle that not so simple question?
It is not so simple. It's separated into two. On the questions, what will happen, I have to provide the intelligence analyst answer, which
Please.
is, I have no clue, absolutely no clue how it will unfold. Too many variables, too many dynamics, too many unexpected. No one really knows what strategy will be taken. The possibilities are so many that anyone who can predict that or gives in a prediction is committing an absolute sin. I have no idea. It could head in so many different directions. That is, and I could lay them out, which if I were to, as an analyst, what would be the consequences of that or that, but this is as much as one can go. But they can take another approach, which is not the one of an analyst, but what would I want and hope would be the policy pursued that is in our interest, at least, to pursue. And when I say ours, I mean the United States in its own front, Israel, their allies, all of who are actually targeted and attacked by radical Islam, anti-Western jihadist group of this kind, be them state supporters or themselves not state actors and so forth. I do hope that the current crisis would subside thanks to some very creative degree of international activity, involvement, and statesmanship. There is room for that. No one has a built-in interest in escalating that much further, whereas everybody has interest in having this round subside so that one should recover some of the losses sustained and perhaps resolve some of the issues that opened up. There are many things that have to be done now. For example, we do have the situation of those uprooted people who found themselves now just moving around being with homelessness. This is true about some Palestinians on the Gaza Strip, which is a social humanitarian issue which had to be dealt with. But we have the same with almost a 250,000 Israelis who have been displaced from the vicinity of Lebanon or the vicinity of Gaza. And this is a condition we've never seen. There are around Tel Aviv, hundreds of thousands of families which have been displaced. So we have to sort this out. It is an urgent issue. We have to bring about the cessation of hostilities. At the moment, there's still some going on between us and the Hezbollah. And in Gaza, of course, we are now trying to simply defeat the Hamas, as that being the goal of this part. But with others, we have to bring that to an end. The two-state solution is a political issue which relates to, since this is part of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, how are we going to resolve this conflict? It is very difficult because this has been the conflict for more than a century. We've been going around in different circles, different time, different circumstances, but we've never been able to resolve that conflict. The golden rule has always been one of partition. We take the Holy Land and we divide it almost half by half, Transjordan included, in which the Arabs the Palestinians are given their homelands or nation or whatever aspirations they have, and the Jews are given where they are in presence and so forth. That has been the golden formula from almost a century, but it was never consummated to the last detail, even because even the most moderate of Palestinians have never really agreed that even if given a state along the borders of 67 plus or minus, that would be an end to all their claims. And there is fear that their ultimate claims still remain the complete abolition of the Jewish state. This is the Hamas and Iran declared objective. Both countries call for the demise of Israel. Now, with this policy entertained and promoted by those militarily active, then we cannot accommodate by a compromise. A two-state solution is not acceptable to them. The Hamas have always rejected the demand by the quartet that they accept not to practice terrorism, that they recognize the state of Israel, and that they accept all that was agreed between us and the Palestinian Authority. They consistently refuse that. The Hamas stated position and real goal is at most to have a period of truce or a period of ceasefire, but they stick stubbornly to the complete denial of Israel's right to exist, and they intend to use means to do that. So does Iran. My belief is that until we remove those threats to those practiced and pursued actually by either the diverse Islamic radical terrorist groups stretching from Africa to Asia, and until we do to such threat coming from Iran, we will still have the major battle ahead of us. So this skirmish should possibly end. Whatever issues we can resolve amicably with the Palestinians, those who are moderate and those who are forthcoming, we should. If the notion of a two-state solution is the preferred solution, we should proceed on that basis. In fact, we should have ongoing negotiations with the Palestinians all the time. We should try wherever possible to practice constructive diplomacy, so as we should with the Lebanese. But at the same time, we should be cognizant that those who are not at all intent on coming to such compromise, there is no alternative but to completely degrade their capabilities and ultimately defeat them so as to remove the threat, which is to us and to others.
Thanks, Uzi. What we're going to do right now is lift and shift, and we'll go to questions from our worldwide audience. And I may weigh in on some of these, but I think the audience wants to hear from you first. So we'll see what we have for questions. I'm going to turn to Amanda, our amazing curator of questions.
And I'm also a person who reminds you that you have an amazing book that you wanted to mention.
Yeah, since our audience always waits for a book review, or at least I imagine they always wait for a book review from me or a recommendation. Shabtai Shavit was head of Mossad. No doubt Uzi knows Shabtai. He passed away recently, as I understand it. I met him in Israel, and he published a book called Head of Mossad, Head of the Mossad. And I appreciated the stories that he told and his perspectives. And I enjoyed meeting him on the ground in Israel. And I should mention during that trip, I had an opportunity to go to Golan. I had the opportunity to go to the kidnapping site by Hezbollah of an Israeli soldier on the northern border between Israel and Lebanon. So I had a sense during that trip of what was happening on the ground and the dynamics that Israel's security and intelligence services had to deal with. But I want to remind the audience that that's a great book. It's a great starting point if you're interested in understanding how the Mossad handles some of the Middle East challenges they have from the perspectives of a former director. So that is my book recommendation. Questions?
May I just
yes,
interject
please.
something about Shabtai Shavit? Yes, by all means, I follow your suggestion that this book be read, because all those interested in the character of leaders of intelligence organizations should look up to Shabtai as a prototypical leader of the Mossad. The fact that he promoted me twice should not matter for me to say that I am not objective about him. But I can tell you he was the consummate and ultimate head of Mossad, professional to the core, discreet in his manner, the absence completely devoid of any bravura or arrogance, serious. He rose from the ranks. He took his job very professionally, and he was one of us, and he's remembered for his many successes. And by the way, one of the things which accounts to his many successes is that he is the only head of the Israeli intelligence organization that did not have a commission of inquiry put in place to do something during his tenure. He ended well. which is a very rare occurrence. So read the book. He was, and we are all sad by his death the other month.
Indeed, we are. Thanks, Uzi, for the personal insights and reflections. What are the questions we have, Amanda?
Okay, I promise, Chris, we're going to get to questions, but any chance I have to talk about our collection, I will. And Uzi, thank you for your comments, and thank you for mentioning the situation when Americans were held hostage in Iran. And we actually have the jeans that William Doherty wore in solitary confinement as a hostage because he was unfortunately very quickly identified as a CIA fellow. And so that feels very close. I always like to connect it to things we have on display in the museums. Now, without further ado, over to questions. And we have some very, very interesting ones. And Uzi, as Chris told you, if you don't want to answer, that's fine with us. But we really want to pick your brain. One of our frequent guests wants to know, what do you think are the practical and political risks and or rewards of reoccupying Gaza?
There are absolutely no rewards in reoccupying Gaza. In fact, it may become a liability if we are forced into this condition, which we would like to be temporary at all, because there is an absence of a responsible body of authority, representative of the Palestinians, who would fill in the vacuum created by the departure of Hamas. But Israel did disengage from Gaza, from every inch of Gaza, back in 2005, 6, and there are only a very few Israelis at the extreme right who have all kind of aspirations to return, but they're not representative of anything, not even the right, because it is not a condition we want to find ourselves in. We want the Palestinians to control their own lives, to care for their prosperity, but we have to make sure that the vacuum created by the departure of Hamas will not be filled in by equally dangerous elements. We have to make sure that no more threats is directed at us from Gaza. And until such time that we can hand over this to responsible organizations, we have to stay there for the time being. But when I mean time being, could be weeks, months. Nobody wants to stay there. We would like to see a replacement in place.
Uzi, can I just jump in there? Can you offer a parallel from a lessons learned standpoint, just to follow up on that question? Great question from the audience. What about Israeli military presence in the past in Lebanon? That had very few rewards from a long view. At least that's my take. Could you share some perspectives? What did the Israelis learn about occupying some of Lebanon over the years?
That is a very important question, Chris, because we could say, what can we learn from there? We were there until after one of those wars. We kept being to have sort of a cordon sanitaire, a kind of a buffer zone that we kept our troops there. But after the war, I think in 2006, was it the one, we withdrew to the international borders. The border was delineated and we withdrew, as said, from every inch of Lebanese territory. Now, some of those Israelis who promoted that withdrawal said, once we do that, there is an end to an Israeli occupation of Arab land in Lebanon. There should be no further territorial claims by the Lebanese. And the Hezbollah, which was a Lebanese organization, has no further demand because we withdrew from all Lebanese territory. So someone argued against this Israeli politician. And can you assure us that Hezbollah would be satisfied that it would become a political force and would become farmers and laborers, since they have liberated Lebanon of all Israeli presence? And he said, yes, I can guarantee that. Ultimately, why should they do anything else? And lo and behold, nothing of that kind happened. Quite the contrary. The Hezbollah moved and grew in strength after our withdrawal, got closer and closer to the border, started to arm themselves to the teeth, obtained hundreds of thousands of rockets aimed at Israel, although they're not about to liberate anything. So why did they do that? Well, the explanation is they have a different motivation. Here, they serve a mission that have been delegated to them by the Iranians. So the Hezbollah of Lebanon play a different political role than the Hamas of the Gaza Strip. They are the instrument that Iran has chosen and tasked them with missions that go much beyond to get Israel out of Lebanese territory because it's no longer there. And their mission is no less than to have those rockets capability much more precise, much more dangerous than anything the Hamas has, that can literally threaten Israeli heartland, and then also trained those raiding parties of Hezbollah fighters, extremely well trained, militarily trained, to no less than invade northern Israel. That's pure offensive without any territorial demands, completely at the service of Iran, its ally, and its own purposes.
Thank you. What else we have, Amanda?
All right, we've got a lot. And
Sure.
yeah, so Uzi, why, and Chris, of course, why do you think Israel did such a large mobilization rather than maybe special forces or, you know, our Delta type of operation as a response? Sorry, I'm trying to use the right words.
Well, you see, I alluded to that at the very beginning, that when we look into it, we committed a mistake in not deploying sufficient defensive forces on the ground, anticipating the possibility of surprise. You cannot gamble on the continuous success of surprise. In fact, you know that surprises will occur primarily when the attacker plans on surprising you. And if he devotes that attacker much attention to surprising, as they did, it stands to succeed. And you have always to have a policy of risk aversion, so to speak. You have to have minimal defensive forces on the ground to blunt the attack. We did not have them because there were Jewish holidays, mind you, the effect of culture. So many of those who were supposed to, the very few, were not there. And they simply, it is a lapsus in our operational policy there, not having sufficient troops. This is one of the reasons why you had the intervention of the special units, not because they were thought needed, but they were the only ones who were capable of acting on a very short notice. They could be grouped immediately. Some of them ran to the field. A relative of our family died on the same day, being a member of the Sayeret Matkal in the very first hour, because he ran without receiving orders. He knew what to do. He just ran and grouped on the spot and on the spur of the moment and at his own initiative tried to storm a concentration of the Hamas terrorists. So it is the involvement of those special units that led them to do it because they were there at that first day. Later on, because they are well trained to do certain things. The reserves are needed because we have to fill in the ranks. The Hamas had successfully penetrated Israeli territory, and they were bent on advancing even further. We know their plans. Their plans were to reach Israeli cities, to reach Israeli bases. You know, I don't know, you cannot use that word, but they had the audacity of thinking big. And so had there not been stopped, once we put in some forces, they could have gone even further and created more havoc. The Israeli defense forces are based on the use of reservists, and not the standing army. The standing army is too thin. And it is our history, by the way, from the very first wars. Whenever we had those big wars, it is the reservist who carry the day, not the standing army. It is the reservists, and even now, still we have hundreds of thousands of Israeli citizens, civilians. They all left their professions, their families, their kids, and they've been spending now months there doing their job with immense devotion and dedication and a sense of patriotism. It amazes even us who think that we've seen everything. But it is this dedication and devotion of those younger reservists in their 20s and 30s, and some even in their 40s, who are even now carrying the day. This is how our army is structured. It may be that after the war, we would have some second thoughts and develop a different force structure, which relies more on standing forces and puts less of a burden on the reservists, because you cannot keep them for long. Their absence from daily life here is noticed economically, socially. You cannot take people away for months on, leaving their families behind. This is an unstable condition. This is why we always wanted to finish our wars very swiftly. This one is a longer war, so we'll probably draw some lessons and change the structure of our military in years to come.
And to the point of that question, I suspect the correlation of forces will change, and eventually the conventional forces will be taken over, so to speak, by more special operations. In other words, there'll be less conventional forces and more special operations involved once the offensive in the south of Gaza takes place. That's how I see it. I could be wrong, but I think that special operations are going to have an increasingly significant role. I know they're currently involved. You alluded to one of the special operations units. I know the Yamam's been involved. I know the Shin Bet was involved with the rescue operation. So special operations are going to be factored in to current Israeli military operations, but I suspect in time less conventional forces and more special operations in the long haul. That's how I see it. I could be wrong. Did you want to comment on that, Uzi, or anything to add to what I just offered?
Yes, I think that you're right. I think this is the inevitable way we're going. By the way, it also calls for cooperation among those special units internationally. We are in the same war in some ways, and it is cooperation among those special forces. Some of them already train with one another, and I think that some of our special units know their American colleagues and hold them to a very high esteem. So are the British, by the way. The special forces of all countries are special, and it is this kind of targeted, careful means that they have to employ, which is interesting because we tend to think that technology, which helps in so many ways, would be the kind of game changer. But it turns out that, yes, technology is doing wonders. But at the end of the day, you have to have the human element, in this case, the professional soldier. Those select few who train hard and handle themselves well, and are the ones who have to do the job on the ground effectively, and sometimes with minimal loss of corollary lives. And this is one of their traits, their surgical capabilities.
Well said. The importance of relationships and partnerships are crucial in the counterterrorism campaigns fought across the planet, frankly, from Africa to Afghanistan in the past. Those relationships are crucial, and I know some of the partners, I won't name them, that are on the ground presently and conferring with Israel. So thanks for that. Amanda?
Yeah,
What other questions do we have?
I think we have room for at least this one, and this is the kind of question I like. How can countries at war use approaches of de-escalation in terms of countering terrorism, and negotiation. We know I like a gentle question so that I don't go home and cry all afternoon after the program.
Yes, there is much room for creativity and hard bargaining and the practice of statesmanship at the highest level to bring about the de-escalation which is needed now. Because what one employs in this condition is to find the common denominators and those interests and incentives that motivate people or entities into cooperation rather than being in conflict. And all over this very dicey situation in the Middle East, there are many cases in which the parties have certain common interests or create the common interest. So how does one leverage the ability to find compromises or trade-offs or any condition to meet the desires of certain parties so that that would transcend the inclination to keep on feuding or arguing. So you need for this, the United States has often played a very instrumental role. In this case, the US is doing just that. It is active internationally. Its leaders are involved directly in contact with a number of groups and countries which can play a role in resolving some of the issues which lie at the core or are there in presence. And in fact, I think that if all this is done and consummated to the last extent, that could be beginning of a way to resolve the matter. For example, the creation of that multinational force that would come and fill the void in Gaza so as to make sure that it remains demilitarized, that it is not menacing, that it would resolve the problem of the Palestinians, civilians who have the legitimate aspirations to live peacefully. For this, you have you need international creativity. You need using means, sometimes financial means, sometimes arm twisting, sometimes persuasion. It calls for a great deal of action. It is interesting that in those activities, you find the leaders of intelligence organizations. One cannot fail to notice that both on the Egyptian side and on the Israeli side, the chiefs of intelligence, those who should actually run spies and do other things, are now heavily involved into what is diplomacy and negotiating deals that involve rescuing hostages and putting in place security systems. It's not the first time, and we probably have to see more of that. The intelligence services have a role in this diplomacy, but it doesn't end there. You have, of course, the involvement of secretaries of state, as is in the American case, and similar functionaries at the Israeli end and other ends. So a whole host of means can be employed to resolve issues, but one should be very sober about them. When you have motivations which are extremist and which are limitless in terms of their degree of violence, it is very difficult to find compromises. But whenever you have less than maximalist or extremist or jihadist elements, you have those who have just their national interest at stake. There is always room for constructive deals and arrangements of all kind. The diplomacy knows many such systems, many such mechanisms. They have to be employed with vigor and with talent and with dedication, because they are very tall orders. I really appeal to the use of those means by the highest of officials in all the countries involved.
Uzi just covered the waterfront with respect to instruments of national power, diplomatic, intelligence, military. You even mentioned economic levers. So you covered the waterfront. You're exactly right. All my War College peers, former peers would be excited. I think that's about it, right? Do
Yeah,
we have anything else?
Any
Uzi,
final comments?
Final comments from you, Uzi. This has been an absolute privilege to hear from you on the ground in Israel, to hear your perspectives with your vast experience. Any final comments?
Well, I wish luck to our respective intelligence communities, to the American intelligence community, which is doing its hardest in the service of the nation. I wish the same to ours. I can only refer to my country to being at the condition of a certain domestic instability, which does not make it easy to operate in politicized circumstances, which are sometimes dysfunctional. Such things also happen to other societies. I wish all our societies the best that they can. By the way, I used to tell my own prime minister, to tell him, when he had all kind of comments and sometimes dismissive comments about the intelligence community, I told him, leaders get the intelligence they deserve.
Thank you so much, Uzi. Thank you, Chris. This has really been really riveting. We could not get to all the questions, you know that, but thanks for everyone who wrote anything in. We do a variety of programs, live and virtual, and you can find those on the Spy Museum website calendar, and we'd love to see you online or in person. Everyone, take care. Let's hope for calmer days ahead. What do you think?
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Uzi.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Chris, and all the best to all of you.